When I was a couple weeks short of my 70th birthday, I started thinking about my mother's mother, who lived to be 100, and her mother, who lived to be 102, and my father, who lived to be 90, longer than anyone we had ever heard of in his family. I began to think that maybe our generation could be the first to routinely live to be 100. When I talked about this at family dinner one night, my granddaughter, who was 5, said,
"What are you going to do for the next 30 years, Grandpa?"
Hello, I'm Dr. Janet Price.
And I'm Gregg Kaloust. And we are Oldish. And this is our podcast, Oldish.
If you're oldish or know someone who is, please join us every week for conversations amongst ourselves
And our special guests
about what it means to be oldish in the 21st century.
If you ever wonder whether you're getting old, you're oldish. What are you going to do for the next 30 minutes? Hi, I'm Greg, and I'm oldish.
Hi, I'm Janet, and I'm oldish. Welcome to this episode of our podcast, Oldish, Conversations on Aging in the 21st Century. We're glad that you're joining us. Today is a shortish episode, and we'd like to take some time to talk about something major that happened recently as far as an anniversary. It was 60 years ago that Martin Luther King gave his speech on I Have a Dream. And so, Greg, let's talk a little bit about what it's like to be oldish and be remembering that moment, that time, what it might have meant to us when we were 10, 12, 13, and what has happened since then and where we are now as oldish people. Martin Luther King was a profound mover and shaker at that time for more equality among all people. His talks, his speeches have continued to make an impact since that time to this present day. He made a speech that was attended by 150,000 people. It was apparently a maybe 2-day gathering with a number of speakers. And he was the one that was the most articulate, visionary, hopeful. He was a leader among the Black community, which at that time was called Negro. It was a speech that turned out to motivate and electrify and inspire many, many, many Black people at that time, and then for years to come. It's a speech that has resonated to this day.
So as I recollect it, and I've done a little bit more looking up to refresh my memory, there was a speech that was made on the Lincoln Memorial, and it was the culmination of what I remember being called a March on Washington. There were 250,000 people, I read, who were gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial for this speech. There was music and other speeches as well, but Martin Luther King was the keynote speaker at this. There was a large, peaceful civil rights march during the height of the civil rights movement back in the 50s through the 60s. It was peaceful as far as I can recall, and I haven't seen anything that said, oh, there were police or whatever. It was completely peaceful, which was a big part of Martin Luther King's message, was change that's not done peacefully, that doesn't come about through peaceful means, isn't really change. It's just changing who wins the violence. I was wondering about the historical context of it, and it was just before the vote on the Civil Rights Act was coming up in the Congress that would recognize that everybody had civil rights and put an end, or attempted to put an end to, a lot of the Jim Crow laws and discrimination and those things that were still lingering, 100 years after the end of the Civil War. I didn't remember this part, but it was before John Kennedy was assassinated, and it was before Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And they were two big political leaders who were encouraging of the civil rights movement. And the speeches were peaceful, but not long afterwards, the assassination started. And JFK was assassinated, Martin Luther King was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and there were probably a few others that I'm not even thinking of. It was peaceful, but not much was around it, so to speak. And it was about to get really non-peaceful pretty quickly. So how do you think that speech and that movement and that feeling affected your life?
Well, I have an interesting trajectory around all of this since I am biracial and I was adopted into a white family. And when I was born in the early 50s and adopted, that was pre-civil rights. And my mother, who was white, was very worried about me and how I would survive when I grew up. And I think that she hoped that I would pass, which was a not uncommon thought for Black people who were light-skinned or biracial people. And then Martin Luther King came, and I found out that she had said to a friend that she'd been praying for me ever since I was little, that somehow I would be okay when I grew up. And she didn't know that this was how her prayers would be answered. So there's a place for Martin Luther King in my heart that's very special, period. You know, how it's impacted me throughout my lifetime. And now as an oldish person, I think that when all those people were murdered, assassinated, I remember feeling a great sense of hopelessness. And I think I moved into a phase of not being sure if people could change things, that these people who were trying so hard to change things were killed. And now as an oldish person, having had a Black president and women in positions of power, you know, you and I were talking about that there were no women speakers at this conference with Martin Luther King that weekend. So some things have changed, but I still feel, I don't know how we're going to get to a place of equity and acceptance for all. One thing that Martin Luther King said in his speech was, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I feel like we still have a really long way to go for that to happen.
Do you think things are better than they were?
I don't know. It's interesting because when Obama became president, that was a moment where I felt incredible hopefulness and felt like, here we are. This is it. Now anything is possible. And here's this Black family in the White House showing our country and the world that it's not the color of your skin, but it's the content of your character. But then after Obama finished 8 years and could not be president anymore, since then, it's been, I don't even know what a good word is that I can say on the podcast, but, and at first I still think this is true, but at first I thought, oh, this is the backlash, and this is people who are having a hard time moving through this transition to a place of acceptance that this is the world. This is how our country should look. This is, this is our country. It's full of people of many different skin color, perspective, and now we're there. And so at first I thought these people that are pushing so hard for something opposite are just having a hard time. But we're still having a hard time. And I still feel like our country has lost its footing. And so I don't know.
It's a hard one to tell. One of the things that has come to my mind about we had a Black president for 2 terms. And one of the ways to look at how that happened was that Obama beat the best that the Republicans had to offer. And they were, I think arguably Mitt Romney and John McCain were from the Republican Party that I grew up knowing about. They were actually very good representatives of the Republican Party, and they were the best that the Republicans had to offer. And Obama beat them twice handily. Next time around, what had bubbled up, and I think a lot of it, I don't think it's an overstatement to say this, but what had bubbled up because a Black man was president was a lot of white resentment. And that bubbled up. And so the next time around, they said, oh, yeah, you beat the best of us. Try beating the worst of us. And, so the worst came up. I'm hardened a little bit in that it's the hatred, the ugliness is out in the open more than it was. And it's met with a lot of resistance. That ugliness and hatred is met with a lot of resistance. And not indifference, but a lot of resistance. It's like, no, you can't be that way here. You can't act that way here. That's not how the United States of America is. So I'm a little bit heartened by that. There's still huge inequalities, and there's a lot of places in America where the skin color still matters.
Absolutely. Well, one thing that I have that I've felt hopeful about over the years is just the exposure or presentation of people of color, people with brown or black skin, Black people that we see around us in the media. I remember when my youngest was a baby, so that would have been, well, about 35 years ago. It was the first time I had seen in the grocery store diapers being sold with an advertisement of the little baby, and it was a Black baby. It was the first time. So that would have been like 1986, 1987, 88. So I bought it, and I didn't even use those diapers, but I was so excited. I was so incredibly excited to see this little adorable, cute Black baby. And then I remember the first time that I saw a Black model in one of the clothing magazines that I would get through the mail. It was a first. And so that was probably in the 1980s. And I was so excited that I ripped it out of the catalog and put it up on my refrigerator because it was like, I can't believe it. The magazines that show what's beautiful finally has included a Black woman. Now, when I look at clothing magazines or commercials or TV shows, there's Black people and brown people and people from different cultures all over the place. In fact, it feels like some kind of formula that when they make a show, they're like, hey, we need to have someone who's white. We need to have someone who's a woman. Probably need to have someone who's a LGBTQ. We need to have a Black person. We need to have a Latino person, because it's like the shows have like all of it. And so it's a little bit unrealistic in that way, but I feel like, okay, go for it. This is like so different than, 40 years ago.
Someone that I know well has often pointed out that the media is ahead of the culture, and that there are, in television shows and news shows and in music, there's a much wider representation of different people, certainly than there used to be, and that a lot of the politics, for example, is still 90% white men, but the culture is not. And there used to be a lot of ruckus about, there would be a black person on a TV show, or a black person would kiss a white person on a TV show. I remember huge ruckuses about that. I could probably, if I thought about it, I could remember the first time that happened in a TV show, but I think the show was canceled because there was so much noise about it. And now it's like, if you don't have that, you don't stand a chance.
Please think about what that's saying to everybody who's watching TV and kids growing up. I never saw that. I never, meaning never, 0%, saw a black person who was just a cool kid growing up. Black people were breaking into stores and were criminals and were scary. And now kids are growing up with really cool black role models and Latino and all sorts of, different cultures and races and all of that. So that is a big deal. And I guess we're moving towards a place where all of that could become integrated, and it would be reflected in our politics and reflected in how we treat each other and reflected in how we feel about ourselves and other people.
I feel, as an oldish person, I feel good about the future as far as that stuff goes, because I think that our children and grandchildren are growing up in a world where a lot more diversity is accepted and expected. It's not true culture-wide, I don't think, but I don't feel any discrimination in any of my grandkids. I don't feel like any of them feel any of that discrimination or discomfort. And that's a way better world than the one that I grew up in.
We're running out of time, but I wanted to just throw in that, as far as I know, the latest Spider-Man movie, which is animated, is a black teenage boy. It was like,
yes.
Hey, when would that have happened years ago?
That wouldn't have happened years ago.
No.
The world is still very scary to me. It's not racially calm or ethnically calm or equal in any real meaningful sense across the board, but it's way better than it used to be. And I think the trend is toward that continuing, that, someday Martin Luther King's dream will come true. It's still swinging back and forth. There's a pendulum and there's backlash and there's all kinds of stuff. But I feel, as an oldish person now, I feel like that's hopefully getting better. I think it is getting better. I hope it's getting better.
Yes. And on that note, we will say thanks for joining us in this podcast, and we'll have more coming. And if there's anything you want to share, put it in our notes. Any thoughts, any ideas, we'd love to hear from you.
That's right. Thank you, Janet. If you go to www.oldish.me, you can leave a comment on this or any of our other episodes, and we will be happy to engage with that. So thanks, Janet. It's nice seeing you again.
Good to see you too, Greg.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That's it for now. Thanks for listening. We enjoyed our visit and hope you did too. Our next episode will be a meeting of the Oldish Book Club. We'll be discussing an oldish heist thriller from Swedish author Katarina Engelman Sundberg. What happens when a group of octogenarians decides to escape their retirement home and get sent to prison? It's entertaining, insightful, and quintessentially oldish. You can leave comments or requests for topics or guests on this or other episodes at www.oldish.me. There's a link there too if you've wondered how you can help support our podcast. If you like what you heard today, please tell a friend and rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.